In the land of Egypt, a terrible rule was made: all baby boys born to the Israelites must be taken away. But one brave mother loved her baby boy too much to let anything happen to him. She hid him for 3 months, whispering prayers for his safety every day. As the baby grew, she knew she couldn't hide him forever. So, she made a special basket and placed him gently inside, setting him afloat on the Nile River, trusting that God would protect her precious child. The baby's sister, Miriam, quietly followed the basket as it floated down the river. She watched anxiously as it drifted closer to where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. When the princess found the baby, she was moved by his sweet cries and decided to keep him. She named him Moses, which means, drawn out of the water, and unknowingly, she had begun the incredible journey of a future leader. Moses grew up in the grand palace of Egypt, surrounded by riches and luxury. But even though he was treated like a prince, he never forgot that he was an Israelite. Deep inside, he knew he was different, and he often wondered about the people who were working so hard under the hot sun, building cities and monuments for the Pharaoh. One day, as Moses watched the workers, he saw an Egyptian guard being very cruel to an Israelite. Moses couldn't stand it, and in a moment of anger, he struck the guard to protect the Israelite. But Moses knew that what he had done was dangerous. Fearful of the Pharaoh's punishment, Moses decided to leave the palace and run away to a faraway land. Moses traveled far and wide until he reached a place called Midian. There, he met a kind man named Jethro and married his daughter, Zipporah. Moses started a new life as a shepherd, taking care of Jethro's sheep. The desert was quiet and peaceful, very different from the bustling life he had known in Egypt. Years passed, and Moses thought his days of adventure were behind him. But God had other plans. One day, while Moses was leading his sheep near a mountain, he noticed something strange. There was a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. Curious, Moses went closer to see what was happening. As Moses approached the burning bush, a voice called out his name: "Moses, Moses." Moses was startled and looked around, but no one was there. Then the voice spoke again: "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed and listened carefully. The voice told Moses that it was God speaking to him. God said he had seen the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt and that he had chosen Moses to go back and lead them to freedom. Moses was shocked and afraid. He wondered how he could possibly stand up to Pharaoh and lead an entire nation. But God reassured Moses, promising that he would be with him every step of the way. Moses wasn't sure he could do what God was asking. He felt nervous and worried. What if they don't believe me? Moses asked God. But God showed Moses special signs to prove that he would be with him. He turned Moses' staff into a snake and then back into a staff again. He even made Moses' hand change, showing that God had the power to do anything. Even with these signs, Moses still felt uncertain. He told God that he wasn't good at speaking, and he didn't think he could convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. So, God told Moses that his brother, Aaron, would go with him and help him speak. With that, Moses gathered his courage, knowing that with God's help, he could do anything. With a heavy heart but newfound courage, Moses said goodbye to his family in Midian and began his journey back to Egypt. His brother, Aaron, met him along the way, and together they prepared to face Pharaoh. The journey was long, but Moses knew that God was guiding him. When they arrived in Egypt, Moses and Aaron went straight to the Israelites to tell them what God had said. The Israelites were overjoyed at the news that God had not forgotten them. They bowed their heads and worshipped, full of hope that their suffering would soon end. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh in his grand palace, surrounded by the splendor of Egypt. Moses took a deep breath and delivered God's message: "Let my people go, so they may worship me in the desert." Pharaoh looked at Moses with anger and disbelief. "Who is this God that I should obey him?" Pharaoh scoffed. "I do not know your God, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh's refusal was the beginning of a long and difficult struggle. But Moses and Aaron were not discouraged. They knew that God would keep his promise to free the Israelites, no matter how powerful Pharaoh seemed. To show Pharaoh that he was serious, God instructed Moses to perform a miracle. Aaron struck the Nile River with his staff, and the water turned to blood. The fish died, and the river smelled awful. But even this terrible sight didn't change Pharaoh's mind. He hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go. Despite the failure, Moses and Aaron continued to trust in God. They knew that this was only the beginning of the amazing things God would do to free his people from slavery, after Pharaoh refused to listen to God's command to let the Israelites go. Moses and Aaron returned to him. This time, God sent a second plague. Aaron stretched out his staff over the waters of Egypt, and suddenly, frogs swarmed the land. Frogs were everywhere, in the houses, in the beds, and even in the ovens. The people of Egypt were horrified, and Pharaoh begged Moses to ask God to take the frogs away. Moses prayed to God, and the frogs died, but Pharaoh broke his promise and refused to let the Israelites go. Even with the land full of dead frogs, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Not long after, God sent Moses and Aaron to Pharaoh again. This time, God instructed Aaron to strike the dust of the ground with his staff. When he did, the dust turned into tiny gnats that filled the air and covered every person and animal in Egypt. The gnats buzzed and bit, making everyone miserable. The magicians of Egypt tried to copy this miracle, but they couldn't. They told Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But even so, Pharaoh's heart was stubborn, and he would not let the Israelites go. Next, God sent a swarm of flies. Flies filled the houses of the Egyptians, buzzing loudly and landing on everything. But something amazing happened. The flies did not enter the homes of the Israelites. God was protecting his people. Pharaoh was troubled and called for Moses. He promised to let the Israelites go if the flies were taken away. But once Moses prayed and the flies left, Pharaoh again changed his mind. He refused to let God's people go, and the land of Egypt continued to suffer. God sent Moses to Pharaoh with another warning, but Pharaoh would not listen. So, God sent a terrible plague on the animals of Egypt. The horses, donkeys, camels, and cows became sick, and many of them died. But once again, God protected the animals of the Israelites, and not one of them got sick. Even after this, Pharaoh's heart was as hard as ever. He refused to let the Israelites go, and his stubbornness brought more suffering upon Egypt. Then, God instructed Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and toss it into the air in front of Pharaoh. The soot caused painful boils to break out on the skin of the Egyptians. The sores were so bad that even the magicians couldn't stand before Moses because they were covered in boils. Despite this terrible suffering, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He would not listen to God's command, and the people of Egypt continued to suffer because of their leader's stubbornness. God sent Moses with another message to Pharaoh. He warned that if Pharaoh didn't let the Israelites go, a terrible storm of hail would come. But Pharaoh refused again, and so the storm came. Hailstones as big as fists rained down, destroying crops and animals in the fields. It was the worst storm Egypt had ever seen, but once again, the land of the Israelites was spared. When Pharaoh saw the destruction, he called for Moses and begged him to stop the storm. Moses prayed, and the hail stopped, but Pharaoh's heart was still stubborn. He would not let God's people go. Pharaoh's refusal brought another disaster upon Egypt. God sent a strong wind that blew in swarms of locusts. The locusts ate every green thing left after the hailstorm. There was nothing left for the Egyptians to eat. The land was ruined, and the people were desperate. Pharaoh quickly called Moses and begged for forgiveness. But once the locusts were gone, Pharaoh again changed his mind. His heart was hardened, and he refused to let the Israelites go, bringing even more suffering upon his people. Then God sent a darkness so thick that the Egyptians couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. For 3 days, the darkness covered the land, and no one could move. But in the land of the Israelites, there was light. Pharaoh was frightened by the darkness and called for Moses. He promised to let the Israelites go, but only if they left their animals behind. Moses refused, saying that they needed their animals to worship God. Pharaoh, in his anger, sent Moses away and refused to let the Israelites go. God told Moses that one final plague would come, and after this, Pharaoh would finally let the Israelites go. This plague would be the most terrible of all, the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian family. But God provided a way for the Israelites to be saved. He told them to take a lamb and put its blood on the doorframes of their houses. That night, when the angel of death passed over Egypt, it would see the blood and pass over the houses of the Israelites. The Israelites did as God commanded, and that night, the firstborn in every Egyptian household died. But the Israelites were safe, just as God had promised. Pharaoh's heart was finally broken, and he told Moses to take the Israelites and leave Egypt. With Pharaoh's permission, the Israelites quickly gathered their belongings and left Egypt. They had been slaves for so long, but now they were free. The people were filled with joy as they marched out of Egypt, led by Moses, following God's pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But Pharaoh soon changed his mind. He ordered his army to chase after the Israelites and bring them back. The Israelites were frightened when they saw Pharaoh's chariots approaching, but Moses told them not to be afraid. "Stand firm," he said, "and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. The people were terrified and cried out to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, just to die in the desert?" But Moses remained calm. He knew that God had a plan. God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. When he did, the waters parted, creating a dry path through the sea. The Israelites quickly crossed to the other side. With walls of water towering on both sides. They couldn't believe their eyes. God was saving them in a miraculous way. As the Israelites reached the other side, Pharaoh's army charged into the sea after them. But God wasn't finished yet. He told Moses to stretch out his staff again, and when he did, the waters of the sea rushed back into place, covering Pharaoh's army. The chariots and soldiers were swept away, and the Israelites were safe. The people cheered and sang songs of praise to God for delivering them from Pharaoh. They were finally free, and they knew that God was with them. Moses led them in a song of victory, celebrating the mighty power of God. The Israelites continued their journey through the desert, but soon they began to complain. They were tired, thirsty, and hungry. They forgot how God had saved them from Egypt and started to doubt that he would take care of them. Moses prayed to God, and God answered by providing water from a rock and sending quail for meat. But the most amazing thing was the bread that God sent from heaven every morning. It was called manna, and it tasted sweet like honey. The Israelites gathered the manna each day, just as God commanded, and they had enough to eat. Every morning, when the dew disappeared, the ground was covered with small white flakes. This was the manna that God had provided for the Israelites to eat. The people gathered it, and it was enough to feed everyone. The manna was sweet like honey and could be baked into bread or cooked in different ways. God told the Israelites to gather only as much manna as they needed for each day. On the sixth day, they were to gather twice as much, so they wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath. The people were amazed at how God provided for them every day, and they learned to trust him more and more. As the Israelites traveled through the desert, they often found themselves without water. They began to complain to Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, just to die of thirst?" Moses prayed to God. And God told him to strike a rock with his staff. When he did, water gushed out of the rock, and the people were able to drink their fill. The Israelites were amazed at how God continued to provide for them, even in the desert. They knew that God was with them, guiding them and taking care of them every step of the way. As the Israelites continued their journey, they were attacked by a group of people called the Amalekites. Moses told Joshua to lead the men in battle, while he went to the top of a hill with the staff of God in his hand. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But when his hands grew tired and he lowered them, the Amalekites started to win, so Aaron and Hur, who were with Moses, held up his hands until the sun set. With their help, Moses was able to keep his hands raised, and the Israelites won the battle. The people rejoiced and thanked God for giving them victory. Moses was a very busy leader, and the people often came to him with their problems. One day, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, came to visit and saw how hard Moses was working. He told Moses, "You're going to wear yourself out. You need to choose some trustworthy men to help you judge the people. That way, you can focus on leading them and teaching them God's ways." Moses listened to Jethro's advice and chose capable men to help him. They judged the people's smaller cases, while Moses handled the more difficult ones. This made things much easier for Moses and helped the people get the help they needed more quickly. The Israelites camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and God called Moses to come up the mountain to receive his laws. The mountain was covered with smoke, and there was thunder and lightning. The people were afraid, but Moses climbed the mountain to meet with God. God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, which were written on stone tablets. These were special rules that God wanted his people to follow, to help them live in a way that pleased him. The commandments taught the Israelites how to love God and how to treat each other with kindness and respect. After receiving the 10 Commandments, Moses came down from the mountain and told the people everything God had said. The Israelites agreed to obey God's commandments, and Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain to offer sacrifices to God. This was a special moment, as the people made a covenant with God to follow his ways. God promised to be with the Israelites and to lead them to the promised land. The people rejoiced and celebrated, knowing that they were God's chosen people, and that he would guide them and protect them on their journey. God called Moses to return to the top of Mount Sinai to receive more instructions. Moses stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, talking with God and learning about the laws and instructions that would guide the Israelites. During this time, God gave Moses detailed plans for building a special place of worship called the tabernacle. The people waited for Moses to return, but as the days went by, they began to worry. They wondered if something had happened to him, and they grew impatient. While Moses was on the mountain, the Israelites became restless and decided to make a golden calf to worship. They gathered all their gold jewelry, and Aaron, Moses' brother, melted it down and shaped it into a calf. The people began to worship the golden calf, saying, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." When Moses came down from the mountain and saw what the people had done, he was furious. He threw down the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, breaking them in anger. Moses knew that the people had sinned against God, and he prayed for God's forgiveness on their behalf. Even though the Israelites had sinned by worshipping the golden calf, God showed them mercy. Moses pleaded with God to forgive the people, and God listened to Moses' prayer. God told Moses to make new stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, and he promised to renew his covenant with the Israelites. The tabernacle was a beautiful and sacred place where the Israelites could offer sacrifices and worship God. It was a reminder that God was with them on their journey, guiding and protecting them. One of the most important parts of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant. This special box was made of wood and covered in gold. Inside the ark, Moses placed the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments. The ark was kept in the most holy place of the tabernacle, and it was a symbol of God's presence with his people. The ark had 2 golden angels on top, with their wings spread out, covering the arkansas. Only the high priest could enter the most holy place where the ark was kept, and only once a year. The ark was a reminder that God was with the Israelites, guiding and protecting them. After the tabernacle was finished, God's presence filled it like a cloud. During the day, the cloud covered the tabernacle, and at night, it looked like a pillar of fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites knew it was time to pack up and continue their journey. When the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, the people stayed in their camp. The cloud and the fire were signs that God was leading the Israelites. They knew that as long as they followed God's guidance, they would reach the promised land. As the Israelites neared the promised land, God told Moses to send 12 men to explore the land of Canaan. These men were to see what the land was like and whether the people living there were strong or weak. The 12 spies spent 40 days exploring the land, and when they returned, they brought back a cluster of grapes so big that it had to be carried on a pole between two men. The spies reported that the land was beautiful and full of good things, but 10 of the spies were afraid. They said that the people living in Canaan were giants, and they didn't think the Israelites could defeat them. But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, trusted in God and encouraged the people to have faith. When the people heard the report of the 10 spies, they were filled with fear. They forgot all the ways that God had protected them and provided for them in the desert. The Israelites began to grumble and complain, saying that they wished they had never left Egypt. Some even wanted to choose a new leader to take them back to Egypt. Moses and Aaron were heartbroken, and Joshua and Caleb tried to encourage the people to trust in God. But the Israelites refused to listen, and their lack of faith brought them great trouble, because the Israelites did not trust God to lead them into the promised land. God said that they would have to wander in the desert for 40 years. During that time, none of the adults who had doubted God would be allowed to enter the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb, who had shown faith. The Israelites were saddened by God's punishment, but they knew that it was fair. They had failed to trust God, even after all the miracles He had done for them. Now, they would have to wait for a new generation to grow up and enter the promised land. As the Israelites continued to wander in the desert, they grew tired and impatient. They began to complain again, saying that they were tired of eating manna and that they didn't have enough water. Their grumbling angered God, and He sent poisonous snakes among them. Many of the Israelites were bitten, and some died. The people realized their mistake and asked Moses to pray to God for help. God told Moses to make a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who was bitten could look at the bronze snake and be healed. Moses did as God commanded, and those who looked at the bronze snake were saved. Moses' sister, Miriam, had been with the Israelites since they left Egypt, helping and encouraging them along the way. But as the Israelites continued their journey, Miriam grew old and passed away. The people mourned for Miriam, remembering how she had helped Moses and how she had led the women in songs of praise after they crossed the Red Sea. Moses was very sad to lose his sister, but he knew that she was with God. Miriam's death was a reminder that the Israelites' journey was long and difficult, but that God was with them every step of the way. Not long after Miriam's death, Moses' brother Aaron also grew old and passed away. Aaron had been the high priest of the Israelites, offering sacrifices and leading the people in worship. Before he died, Aaron passed on his priestly duties to his son, Eleazar. The Israelites mourned for Aaron, remembering how he had helped Moses and how he had served God faithfully. Moses was once again filled with sadness, but he knew that God would continue to guide the Israelites, just as he had promised. As the Israelites continued their journey, they came near the land of Moab. The king of Moab, Balak, was afraid of the Israelites and wanted to curse them. So he sent for a man named Balaam, who was known for his ability to bless or curse people. But when Balaam set out on his journey to meet King Balak, God sent an angel to block his path. Balaam didn't see the angel, but his donkey did, and the donkey refused to move forward. Balaam became angry and struck the donkey, but then something amazing happened. The donkey spoke. The donkey asked Balaam why he was being beaten, and Balaam suddenly realized that God was trying to stop him. After the encounter with the talking donkey, Balaam realized that he could not curse the Israelites because they were blessed by God. When he arrived in Moab, King Balak took him to several places where he could see the Israelites camped in the valley. But each time Balaam tried to speak a curse, only blessings came out of his mouth. King Balak was frustrated, but Balaam explained that he could only say what God told him to say. Instead of cursing the Israelites, Balaam blessed them, declaring that they were a special people chosen by God. Balak was disappointed, but the Israelites continued to be blessed by God. As the Israelites camped near Moab, some of them were tempted to join in the worship of the false god Baal. They were led astray by the Moabite women, who invited them to their sacrifices. This angered God, and he sent a plague among the Israelites. Moses was saddened by the people's sin and commanded that those who had turned away from God be punished. The plague was stopped when the people repented and turned back to God. This was a reminder that the Israelites needed to stay faithful to God and not be led astray by other nations. One day, the daughters of a man named Zelophehad came to Moses with a request. Their father had died without any sons, and they were worried that they would lose their inheritance in the promised land. They asked Moses if they could have their father's share of the land, even though they were women. Moses took their request to God, and God said that the daughters of Zelophehad were right. They were allowed to inherit their father's land, and this became a law for all of Israel. This story showed that God cared about justice and fairness, and that he listened to the concerns of his people. As the Israelites continued their journey, God commanded Moses to take a second census of the people. This census would count all the men who were able to fight in the army. The first census had been taken when the Israelites left Egypt, but now, after many years in the desert, a new generation had grown up. The census showed that God had kept his promise to make the Israelites a great nation. Even though they had wandered in the desert for many years, they were still strong and ready to enter the promised land. Moses was growing old, and God told him that he would not enter the promised land. But God had a plan for the Israelites, and he chose Joshua to be their new leader. Joshua had been Moses' assistant for many years and had shown great faith and courage. God told Moses to lay his hands on Joshua and commission him as the new leader of Israel. Moses did as God commanded, and the people saw that Joshua was chosen by God to lead them. Moses encouraged Joshua to be strong and courageous, knowing that God would be with him just as he had been with Moses. The Israelites camped on the east side of the Jordan River, preparing to cross into the promised land. God told Joshua to get the people ready, for in 3 days they would cross the river and take possession of the land that God had promised them. Joshua sent 2 spies to explore the land, especially the city of Jericho. The spies went to Jericho and stayed at the house of a woman named Rahab, who helped them escape when the king of Jericho heard they were in the city. Rahab believed in God and asked the spies to save her and her family when the Israelites came to conquer Jericho. The spies agreed, and Rahab tied a scarlet cord in her window as a sign. When the time came to cross the Jordan River, God performed another miracle. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant to the edge of the river, and as soon as their feet touched the water, the river stopped flowing. The water piled up in a heap, and the Israelites crossed the river on dry ground, just as they had crossed the Red Sea. The people were amazed at God's power, and they knew that he was with them. Joshua had 12 stones taken from the riverbed and set up as a memorial, so that future generations would remember how God had brought them into the promised land. After crossing the Jordan, the Israelites camped near Jericho. God gave Joshua a plan to conquer the city, but it was a strange plan. For 6 days, the Israelites were to march around the city once a day in silence, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and then the priests were to blow their trumpets. When the Israelites followed God's instructions, the walls of Jericho collapsed. The Israelites charged into the city and captured it, just as God had promised. Rahab and her family were saved, and they joined the Israelites as they continued their journey. After the victory at Jericho, the Israelites prepared to attack the city of Ai. But when they first attacked, they were defeated. Joshua was confused and asked God why they had lost the battle. God told Joshua that someone in the camp had disobeyed his command and taken some of the treasures from Jericho that were supposed to be destroyed. Joshua found out that a man named Achan had sinned by taking some of the forbidden treasures. After Achan confessed, he was punished, and the Israelites were able to defeat Ai in their next battle. This taught the people the importance of obeying God's commands. As the Israelites continued to conquer the land, a group of people called the Gibeonites heard about their victories and decided to trick them. The Gibeonites dressed in old clothes and carried old, worn-out supplies, pretending to be travelers from a distant land. They asked Joshua to make a peace treaty with them. Joshua and the leaders of Israel did not ask God for guidance and agreed to the treaty. When they discovered the deception, it was too late to go back on their word. But God used the situation to teach the Israelites a lesson about the importance of seeking his guidance in everything they did. As the Israelites continued their journey, they started to doubt if they would ever reach the promised land. The desert was hot, and the journey was long. They missed the food they had in Egypt and began to complain to Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the desert?" Moses was troubled by the people's complaints and prayed to God for help. God, in his kindness, heard Moses' prayer and provided for the people, sending quail for them to eat and continuing to supply manna each day. God reminded the Israelites that he was always with them, guiding them to the promised land. As the Israelites journeyed through the desert, they sometimes ran out of water. At one point, they became so thirsty that they started to grumble and complain to Moses again, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt just to die of thirst?" Moses prayed to God, and God told him to take his staff and strike a rock at a place called Meribah. When Moses struck the rock, water flowed out, enough for all the people and their animals to drink. The Israelites were amazed and grateful, but Moses was saddened by their lack of faith. Even though the Israelites doubted and complained at times, God continued to guide them with love and patience. By day, he led them with a pillar of cloud, and by night, a pillar of fire showed them the way. These signs were a constant reminder that God was with them, even in the hardest times. The Israelites learned to trust in God's guidance, knowing that he was leading them to the promised land. And whenever they forgot and started to doubt, Moses reminded them of all the ways God had provided for them on their journey. As the Israelites approached the promised land, God told Moses to send 12 spies to explore Canaan, the land he had promised to give them. The spies were to find out what the land was like and whether the people living there were strong or weak. The 12 spies spent 40 days exploring the land, and when they returned, they brought back wonderful fruit to show the people. But 10 of the spies were afraid and said, "The people in the land are giants. We can't defeat them." Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, believed that with God's help, they could conquer the land. When the Israelites heard the report from the 10 frightened spies, they were filled with fear. They forgot about all the miracles God had done for them and began to grumble, saying, "Let's go back to Egypt. We can't take this land." Joshua and Caleb tried to encourage the people, saying, "We can do it. God is with us." But the Israelites refused to listen. Their lack of faith angered God. And he decided that because they did not trust him, they would have to wander in the desert for 40 years until a new generation was ready to enter the promised land. Because of their lack of faith, the Israelites had to wander in the desert for 40 years. During this time, many of the older generation passed away, and a new generation grew up, learning to trust in God and follow his ways. Even though the journey was difficult, God continued to provide for his people. He gave them manna to eat every day, water from the rocks when they were thirsty, and he protected them from their enemies. The Israelites learned that even in the hardest times, God was with them, guiding them and caring for them. As the Israelites continued their journey, they once again grew tired and impatient. They began to complain about the manna, saying they were tired of eating the same food every day. Their grumbling angered God, and he sent poisonous snakes among them. When the people were bitten by the snakes, many of them died. The Israelites realized their mistake and asked Moses to pray to God for help. God told Moses to make a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who was bitten could look at the bronze snake and be healed. Moses did as God commanded, and those who looked at the bronze snake were saved. Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, had been a strong leader and a source of encouragement for the Israelites. But as the Israelites continued their journey, Miriam grew old and passed away. The people mourned for Miriam, remembering how she had helped Moses and led them in songs of praise after they crossed the Red Sea. Moses was deeply saddened by the loss of his sister, but he continued to lead the Israelites, trusting in God's plan for their journey. Not long after Miriam's death, Aaron, Moses' brother and the high priest of the Israelites, also grew old and passed away. Before he died, Aaron passed his priestly duties to his son, Eleazar. The people mourned for Aaron, remembering how he had faithfully served God and led them in worship. Moses was once again filled with sadness, but he knew that God would continue to guide the Israelites on their journey, just as he had promised. As the Israelites continued their journey, they came near the land of Moab. The king of Moab, Balak, was afraid of the Israelites and wanted to curse them. So he sent for a man named Balaam, who was known for his ability to bless or curse people, but when Balaam tried to curse the Israelites, God stopped him. Instead of cursing them, Balaam ended up blessing the Israelites, declaring that they were a special people chosen by God. King Balak was disappointed, but the Israelites continued to be blessed by God, knowing that he was with them every step of the way. As the Israelites wandered in the desert, they often faced challenges that tested their faith. The desert was vast and sometimes seemed never-ending. Yet, God was always with them, guiding them with the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. The Israelites knew that God was leading them, even when the journey was difficult. Moses reminded the people that they were not alone. He encouraged them to trust in God's plan and to remember the miracles they had already witnessed. The Israelites learned that patience and trust in God were important as they continued their journey toward the Promised Land. During their time in the desert, the Israelites learned many important lessons. They learned to depend on God for their daily needs, whether it was food, water, or protection from their enemies. Each day, God provided manna for them to eat, and he made sure they had everything they needed to survive in the harsh desert. The Israelites also learned that God was their leader, and they needed to follow his commands. When they obeyed God, things went well for them. But when they disobeyed or complained, they faced difficulties. The desert was a place of learning, where the Israelites grew closer to God and prepared for the Promised Land. One day, as the Israelites were traveling, they once again became impatient and started to complain about their journey and the food they were eating. They forgot how much God had done for them and grumbled against him and Moses. In response, God sent poisonous snakes among the people, and many were bitten. Realizing their mistake, the Israelites begged Moses to pray for them. God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Anyone who looked at the bronze serpent would be healed. Moses did as God instructed, and those who looked at the serpent were saved. This taught the Israelites a powerful lesson about the importance of faith and obedience. As the years passed, the older generation of Israelites who had doubted God's promise began to pass away, just as God had said. A new generation grew up, one that had been born in the desert and had learned to trust in God. This new generation was strong and ready to follow God's commands. Moses continued to teach them, sharing stories of how God had delivered them from Egypt and provided for them in the desert. The new generation was eager to enter the Promised Land, and they were determined to obey God and trust in his guidance. The Israelites could sense that their journey was nearing its end. They had traveled through the desert for many years, and now they were close to the Promised Land. The people were filled with hope and excitement, but also with a sense of solemnity as they remembered all they had been through. Moses encouraged the people to stay faithful to God and to remember all the lessons they had learned in the desert. He reminded them that God was bringing them into a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites prepared themselves for the final part of their journey, knowing that the Promised Land was within their reach. As the leader of the Israelites, Moses faced many challenges. The people often came to him with their problems, and sometimes they were unhappy with his decisions. Moses knew that leading so many people was not easy, but he trusted in God to give him wisdom. One of the biggest challenges Moses faced was keeping the people united and focused on God's plan. The Israelites sometimes argued with each other or questioned Moses' leadership, but Moses always pointed them back to God. He reminded them that it was God who was leading them, and that they needed to follow his commands. One day, a man named Korah and a group of others challenged Moses' authority. They didn't like that Moses and Aaron were the leaders and wanted to take over. Korah said, "We are all holy, so why should Moses and Aaron be in charge?" Moses was saddened by this rebellion and prayed to God for guidance. God showed that he had chosen Moses and Aaron by causing the ground to open up and swallow Korah and his followers. This event reminded the Israelites that God had chosen Moses to lead them, and they needed to respect his leadership. During the journey, there was another time when the Israelites ran out of water. Once again, they complained to Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die in the desert?" Moses was frustrated with the people's lack of faith, God told Moses to speak to a rock, and water would come out for the people to drink. But in his frustration, Moses struck the rock with his staff instead of speaking to it. Water still came out, but God was not pleased that Moses had disobeyed him. Because of this, God told Moses that he would not enter the promised land. Even though Moses knew he would not enter the promised land, he continued to lead the Israelites faithfully. He accepted God's decision with humility and focused on preparing the people to enter the land. Moses knew that his role was to guide the people and to teach them God's ways. Moses often reminded the Israelites to trust in God and to follow his commands. He knew that their success in the promised land would depend on their obedience to God. Moses was a humble leader, always putting God's will above his own desires. As the time to enter the promised land drew near, God chose Joshua to be the new leader of the Israelites. Joshua had been Moses' assistant for many years and had shown great faith and courage. Moses laid his hands on Joshua and blessed him, passing on the leadership of the people. Moses encouraged Joshua to be strong and courageous, reminding him that God would be with him just as he had been with Moses. The people also recognized Joshua as their new leader and prepared to follow him into the promised land. Moses had faithfully completed his mission, and now it was Joshua's turn to lead. As the Israelites journeyed through the desert, they became tired and impatient. They began to complain again, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die in the desert? There is no bread, no water, and we detest this miserable food." Their grumbling showed that they had forgotten how much God had done for them. Because of their lack of faith, God sent poisonous snakes among the people, and many were bitten and died. The Israelites realized they had sinned and begged Moses to pray for them. God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Anyone who was bitten could look at the bronze serpent and be healed. Moses did as God instructed, and those who looked at the bronze serpent were saved. The bronze serpent on the pole became a powerful symbol for the Israelites. It reminded them that even when they made mistakes, God was merciful and provided a way for them to be healed. The Israelites learned that they needed to trust in God's plan, even when things were difficult. Moses used this event to teach the people about the importance of faith. He reminded them that just as they had to look at the bronze serpent to be healed, they needed to look to God for their salvation. The Israelites began to understand that trusting in God was the key to their survival and success. After the incident with the bronze serpent, the Israelites continued their journey through the desert. They were now closer than ever to the promised land. But there were still challenges ahead. The people were learning to trust in God more each day, and they knew that He was with them, guiding their steps. Moses continued to lead the people, teaching them about God's laws and preparing them for the day when they would enter the land God had promised to them. The Israelites were growing stronger in their faith, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As the Israelites drew near to the land of Moab, the king of Moab, Balak, became very afraid. He had heard about how God had helped the Israelites defeat their enemies, and he was worried that they would conquer his land as well. So, Balak sent for a man named Balaam, who was known for his ability to bless or curse people. Balak wanted Balaam to curse the Israelites so that they would not be able to defeat him. But God had other plans. When Balaam tried to curse the Israelites, God prevented him from doing so. Instead, Balaam ended up blessing the Israelites, saying that they were a people blessed by God. Even though Balaam had been hired to curse the Israelites, he could only speak the words that God gave him. Each time Balaam tried to curse the Israelites, he ended up blessing them instead. He declared that God was with the Israelites and that they would be victorious over their enemies. King Balak was frustrated and angry that Balaam couldn't curse the Israelites. But Balaam explained that he could only say what God told him to say. The Israelites continued on their journey, knowing that God was protecting them and that even their enemies couldn't harm them without God's permission. The people were filled with confidence, trusting that God would fulfill his promise to bring them to the promised land. As Balaam was on his way to meet King Balak, something unusual happened. Balaam was riding his donkey when suddenly the donkey stopped and refused to move forward. No matter how much Balaam tried to make the donkey go, it wouldn't budge. Balaam became angry and struck the donkey, But then, something miraculous happened. The donkey spoke. The donkey said, "Why are you hitting me? Haven't I always been a good and faithful servant to you?" At that moment, God opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw an angel standing in the road with a sword drawn. The angel told Balaam that the donkey had saved his life by refusing to go forward. Balaam realized that he must only speak the words that God would give him and nothing else. When Balaam finally met with King Balak, the king took him to a high place where he could see the Israelite camp. Balak expected Balaam to curse the Israelites, but when Balaam opened his mouth, he spoke a blessing instead. Balaam said, "How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced?" King Balak was shocked and angry. He had hired Balaam to curse the Israelites, but instead, Balaam had blessed them. Balak decided to take Balaam to another place, hoping that a different view would allow Balaam to curse the Israelites. King Balak took Balaam to another high place, hoping that this time, Balaam would curse the Israelites. But when Balaam looked out over the Israelite camp, he again received a message from God. Once more, instead of cursing the Israelites, Balaam blessed them. Balaam said, "God is not a man that he should lie, nor a human being that he should change his mind. The Lord their God is with them, they have the strength of a wild ox." Balak was even more frustrated, but Balaam explained that he could only speak the words that God put in his mouth. Not giving up, King Balak took Balaam to yet another place, hoping that this time he would succeed in cursing the Israelites. But just as before, when Balaam spoke, he blessed the Israelites instead. Balaam said, "How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you." By now, Balak was furious. He told Balaam to go back home because he had failed to curse the Israelites. But Balaam reminded Balak that he had told him from the beginning that he could only say what God wanted him to say. Before Balaam left, he delivered one final message from God. This time, he spoke of the future, saying that a great king would rise out of Israel, one who would defeat Israel's enemies and rule with justice and power. Balaam's words were a reminder that God had a special plan for the Israelites, and no one could stand against them as long as they remained faithful to him. King Balak was disappointed, but there was nothing he could do. The Israelites, on the other hand, continued on their journey, knowing that God was watching over them and blessing them every step of the way. They were filled with confidence, trusting in God's promise to bring them into the promised land. As the Israelites continued their journey through the desert, God spoke to Moses and gave him a special instruction about Aaron. God told Moses that it was time for Aaron to be gathered to his people, which meant that Aaron's time on earth was coming to an end. Moses was to take Aaron and his son Eleazar up to Mount Hor, where something important would happen. Moses, Aaron, and Eleazar climbed the mountain together. The people watched them go, not knowing what was about to happen. Aaron had been a faithful servant of God and a leader of the people for many years, and now the time had come for him to pass on his responsibilities to his son. When they reached the top of Mount Hor, God instructed Moses to remove the priestly garments from Aaron and place them on Eleazar, his son. This was a special moment because it meant that Eleazar was now the new high priest, taking over the role that Aaron had faithfully fulfilled for so long. As Moses placed the priestly garments on Eleazar, Aaron knew that his work was complete. He had served God and the people with all his heart, and now it was time for him to rest. Aaron passed away on the mountain, and Moses and Eleazar buried him there. It was a quiet and solemn moment, marking the end of an era for the Israelites. When Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, the people realized that Aaron was no longer with them. The entire Israelite community mourned for Aaron for 30 days. They remembered all the ways that Aaron had served them, from helping Moses confront Pharaoh in Egypt to leading them in worship in the desert. The people were sad to lose such a beloved leader, but they also knew that Eleazar would continue the work his father had done. God had chosen Eleazar to be the new high priest, and the people trusted that God's plan was perfect. They knew that even though Aaron was gone, that God's presence was still with them. With the passing of Aaron, Eleazar stepped into his new role as high priest. It was a big responsibility, but Eleazar had learned well from his father. He knew that his job was to help the people worship God and to guide them in following God's commands. Eleazar took his duties seriously, offering sacrifices and leading the people in worship. He knew that God was with him, just as he had been with Aaron. The people respected Eleazar and trusted him to lead them in the right way. Under Eleazar's leadership, the Israelites continued their journey toward the Promised Land, knowing that God was guiding them every step of the way. Aaron's death marked a new beginning for the Israelites. They had lost a great leader, but they also knew that God's work would continue. Moses reminded the people that God was their true leader, and that he would never leave them. The Israelites took comfort in knowing that God had provided a new high priest in Eleazar, and that they were still on the path to the Promised Land. The journey was not over, but they were confident that with God's guidance, they would reach their destination. The memory of Aaron would always be with them, and his legacy of faithfulness would inspire them as they moved forward. As the Israelites approached the Promised Land, Moses gathered everyone together for one last important speech. He wanted to remind the people of everything they had learned and experienced over the years. The air was filled with anticipation and respect as Moses stood before the people, his voice steady and full of wisdom. Moses began by recounting the journey they had been through, from their time in Egypt to their travels in the desert. He reminded them of God's mighty deeds and the importance of obeying his commands. Moses wanted the people to remember that their journey wasn't just about reaching a land, but about following and trusting in God every step of the way. In his next speech, Moses focused on the importance of obeying God's laws. He explained that living according to God's commands would bring them blessings and protect them from harm. Moses emphasized that obedience was the key to living a good and prosperous life in the Promised Land. He told the people to love God with all their hearts and to teach their children about his ways. Moses wanted the Israelites to build their lives on the foundation of God's laws, so they would remain close to him and be a shining example to others. Moses reminded the Israelites of the special covenant God had made with them. He told them that God had chosen them to be his people and had promised to give them a wonderful land. This covenant was a special agreement that they needed to honor and keep. Moses spoke about the blessings that would come if they followed God's laws and the consequences if they turned away from him. He wanted them to understand that their relationship with God was precious and needed to be protected by their obedience and faithfulness. As Moses looked toward the future, he knew it was time to pass on leadership to Joshua. He spoke directly to Joshua, encouraging him to be strong and courageous. Moses reminded Joshua that God would be with him, just as he had been with Moses throughout the journey. Moses also spoke to the people, encouraging them to support Joshua and follow his leadership. He wanted them to understand that even though Moses would not be going with them into the Promised Land, God's presence would remain with them through Joshua's guidance. In his final speech, Moses offered a blessing to the Israelites. He blessed each tribe and prayed that God would grant them peace, prosperity, and protection as they settled into their new land. His words were full of love and hope for the future. Moses concluded his speeches by reminding the people of all that God had done for them and encouraging them to always keep their faith in him. With a heart full of hope and faith, Moses prepared to leave the people and entrust them to Joshua. The Israelites listened intently, knowing that these were the final words of a beloved leader who had guided them through many trials and triumphs. The time had come for the Israelites to prepare for their new home in the Promised Land. Moses knew that before they could enter, they needed to make sure they were ready for the challenges ahead. He gathered everyone together and began to explain the importance of preparation. Moses reminded the people that they were about to enter a land full of new opportunities and challenges. They needed to be prepared to build new homes, farm the land, and follow God's laws. The Israelites were excited but also a bit nervous, knowing that they needed to work together to make the most of this new chapter in their lives. One of the important tasks before entering the Promised Land was to divide it among the tribes of Israel. Each tribe would receive a portion of the land where they could settle and build their homes. Moses worked with Joshua and the leaders of the tribes to plan how the land would be divided fairly. The people gathered to hear about their new homes and where each tribe would live. There was much excitement and discussion as they imagined the future. Moses reassured them that God had a special plan for each tribe and that their new land would be a place of abundance and blessings. Before the Israelites crossed into the promised land, Moses reminded them of the covenant they had with God. This special agreement was a promise that God would be their God, and they would be his people. Moses wanted the people to renew their commitment to follow God's commands and live according to his laws. The people gathered at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim to hear the blessings and curses that would come from obeying or disobeying God's laws. This renewal was a way for the Israelites to show their dedication to God and to prepare their hearts for the new life they were about to begin. As the Israelites neared the edge of the promised land, Moses gave them his final instructions. He reminded them of the importance of staying united and working together as they entered their new land. He also encouraged them to remember the lessons they had learned during their years in the desert. Moses emphasized the need to be strong and courageous, especially when facing new challenges. He reassured them that God would be with them every step of the way, guiding and protecting them as they settled into their new home. The people listened attentively, knowing that these instructions would help them succeed in their new life. With the promised land just ahead, Moses knew it was time to officially pass on the leadership to Joshua. He gathered the people and introduced Joshua as their new leader. Moses prayed for Joshua, asking God to give him wisdom and strength to lead the Israelites. The people welcomed Joshua and promised to support him as they began this new chapter. They were excited and ready to follow Joshua into the promised land. Moses took one last look at the people he had led for so many years, feeling proud of how far they had come. He knew that with God's guidance, the Israelites were ready to enter the land that had been promised to them so long ago. Moses knew that his time to leave the Israelites was drawing near. God told Moses to go up to the top of Mount Nebo, where he would have a final view of the promised land that the Israelites were about to enter. Moses made the climb, his heart full of both sadness and joy. From the top of the mountain, Moses looked out over the vast and beautiful land that stretched before him. It was a land of rolling hills, lush valleys, and flowing rivers. Moses saw the land that God had promised to give to the Israelites. He knew that although he would not enter it himself, the people he had led would soon live there in peace and prosperity. Moses gathered the Israelites for one last farewell. With a voice full of love and wisdom, he reminded them of all the miracles and blessings they had received from God. He spoke about the importance of following God's laws and living a life of faithfulness. The people listened closely, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. They thanked Moses for his years of leadership and guidance. Moses' words were filled with encouragement and hope for the future. He assured them that even though he would not be with them, God would continue to guide and protect them. Moses went up Mount Nebo as God had instructed him. There, he quietly and peacefully passed away. The Bible tells us that Moses was 120 years old at the time, but his eyesight was still strong, and he was in good health. God himself buried Moses in a hidden place on the mountain. The Israelites mourned for Moses for 30 days. They grieved the loss of their great leader and friend. But they also remembered his teachings and the example he had set for them. They knew that Moses had completed his mission, and his legacy would live on in their hearts and in their new land. After Moses' death, it was time for Joshua to take up the mantle of leadership. Joshua had been Moses' trusted assistant and had learned much from him. God spoke to Joshua and assured him that he would be with him, just as he had been with Moses. The people welcomed Joshua as their new leader, ready to follow him into the promised land. Joshua was strong and courageous, and he inspired confidence in the Israelites. With God's guidance, Joshua prepared to lead the people into their new home, ready to begin a new chapter in their journey. With Moses passing in Joshua's leadership, the Israelites were on the brink of a new beginning. They were about to enter the land that God had promised to their ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. The people were filled with excitement and hope for their future. Joshua led the Israelites with wisdom and faithfulness, guiding them as they settled into their new land. The Israelites remembered Moses with gratitude and continued to honor his memory by following the laws and teachings he had passed down to them. And so, the journey that Moses had begun was now a new adventure under Joshua's leadership, as the Israelites stepped into their long-awaited promised land.